So when the question is asked whether I believe, let's say, that the resurrection of Christ is physical fact or symbolic metaphor, I don't know how to deal with that question. I mean, what do you mean?
In this clip, Johnathan Pageau is answering a young evangelical's question on how to make sense of the symbolic understanding of the Christian faith. I want us to pay particular attention to the ideas put forth by Johnathan on the historical resurrection. What I'm finding, and I'm sure many others are as well, is that the interpretation not only of Christianity but the Bible in this Jordan Peterson phenomena is creating lots of confusion over essential and orthodox Christian beliefs. Exhibit A is the issue of the historical resurrection of Jesus Christ. To make sense of the psychology, one can't simply just say that, yes, matter of fact, Jesus Christ did rise from the dead. An elaborate discussion on psychology and how to understand the potentiality of being, on how to understand consciousness, the importance of the symbolic metaphysical world, all of this is required to understand simple orthodox beliefs. And to be honest, I think all of this seems like fluff. It seems like one massive explanation in begging the question. And that seems to be a pretty big problem to me. But don't take my word for it. Let's watch what Johnathan has to say and let me know what you think in the comment section below.
I'm 20 years old, and I spent all of my grade school years at a fundamentalist evangelical Christian private school in Fort Worth, Texas. There, I was educated and immersed in a deeply conservative theological tradition. However, after I graduated, I began to doubt my faith and progressively adopted a rationalist, positivist worldview and became an atheist. Here is where my problem begins. I would now say that I certainly believe in God, an objective morality. I would also say that I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the source of salvation. But I think perhaps that this is true in a symbolic sense rather than in a physical, literal, historical sense. More and more I am convinced that the symbolic reality actually points to the truest reality, but this conception is difficult to square with the way that most people interpret Christianity. For example, my peers and teachers from my old school would not consider someone with these ideas a true Christian, because to them salvation depends on a faith in the literal life, death, and resurrection of Christ. This leads me to the questions I have for you if you're still willing to try to answer them. 1. In your view, what beliefs really make someone a Christian? 2. How much of the Bible do you think is symbolic truth versus physical fact? 3. Do you personally believe that Jesus lived historically and physically rose from the dead, as told in the Gospels? 4. If you think that the Gospel story is symbolic, how do you get along with your Christian community? And lastly, 5. For what reason do you align with Orthodox Christianity specifically? So, I've seen similar questions arise around the type of questions that have been asked of Dr. Peterson. And I've seen on different study groups that people have felt a bit confused and frustrated by some of the answers, or at least felt like those answers didn't fully answer their concerns. And so I'm going to try to answer this as much as I can, and I'm going to try to answer the questions that were posed all simultaneously. So I think that the problem firstly arises because we still hold on to a kind of simplistic materialism, a kind of 19th century modernism, which thinks that the fullness of everything exists completely out there, exactly as we perceive it, a kind of neutral range of measurable phenomena which we can then add meaning to. So in this view, symbolism is opposed, or at least it's divorced from this truly objective world. And if in stories and myths and music or in art we find these patterns of meaning, they're like an abstract layer that we, let's say, subjectively add on to an idiosyncratic and random world. The problem is that that's just not how it works. Or these stories, they're already patterns. We often don't perceive the patterns, but the structure of why we remember something, or how we then order events for others, is already symbolic. Symbolic in the sense that they are ordered and patterned around things that have meaning. So symbolism is not opposed to a kind of neutral physical reality. Rather, symbolism is the very manner in which we perceive and organize the unlimited field of information. And so, see, there is no reality which is not symbolic. The nature of our existence in the world is symbolic. Events coalesce around centers of meaning through our attention and our memory. The world does not unfold randomly. And if in some ways it does, consciousness, attention, and our memory does everything it can to fit things into a pattern. All the random things vanish in the margins of our perceptions. And if there is something truly random, something which both forces itself on our attention and then pushes itself into our memory, we formulate that thing into the category of chaos, of tragedy, of suffering. It's a monster, and we have to contend with it so that we can continue. I mean, if I am forced to remember something which is truly random, it's probably a car crash, an accident of some kind, or something that completely erupts like a revolution into the regular pattern of my experience. Now, in terms of remembering events, there's a personal way of remembering events. There's a communal way of remembering events, a broader social way, and I would even contend that there is a cosmic way of remembering events. And all of these levels of attention and memory will not appear the same. The more we move away from the idiosyncratic how my day went stories, the more we move towards remembering events which have universal significance. The more this memory will appear symbolic, condensed. It has to be, so that it can be attended to and remembered by larger and larger groups over larger and larger spans of time. There are specific idiosyncratic objects or ways of doing things which must disappear, which must be made to fit with a larger and more universal image or universal images so that they can be remembered. So, for example, in the Bible, you can actually see that in the very unfolding of the large story. The more you go back, let's say, towards Genesis, the more the stories appear condensed, symbolic, universal. The forms are compressed through images that reveal more and more meaning. So, does that mean that what's in the Bible does not describe events? Of course it describes events. The problem is that we think that all events are the same. We think that Adam, which means man as such, ate the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, becoming self-conscious of his mortality, having been tempted by a serpent, is on the same level, the same type of event that when I'm picking my nose or washing the dishes. That's the problem. The events in Genesis happened. They're just being remembered at a cosmic level using narrative structures and images that compress so much into them that people have written thousands of books unfolding the implicit meanings contained in those primordial stories. There will be no one writing thousands of books of how I did the dishes last night. If any event in the entire world has definitely happened, it is the story in Genesis 2 and the fall. And just because computer brains like Sam Harris cannot perceive hierarchy in being, a hierarchy of events, and a hierarchy in the manner in which we describe events, just means that they're forced to discount those stories to their peril and to our peril. The stories which our ancestors for thousands of years considered to be the most important and foundational stories, foundational structures of our being, and the underlying origin of what it means to be human. And then you wonder why everyone is so confused and disillusioned. And so when the question is asked whether I believe, let's say, that the resurrection of Christ is physical fact or symbolic metaphor, I don't know how to deal with that question. I mean, what do you mean? What do you expect? Do you expect the telling of the resurrection to fit some kind of technical description, like the kind of description a police officer would give at a crime scene. How could it, and why should it? The problem with the resurrection and with miracles in general is the modern person thinks that the point of the story is understanding a kind of technical description of what happened. Their minds immediately try to calculate the miracle in terms of something which could be reproduced through scientific method. And I just want to slap myself when I see this. Obviously, the resurrection, by its telling, is referring to an event. But why do you think you know what that event is? Why does that event have to fit the level of analysis you want to impose on it? Look at the story itself, even the way it is told. First off, no one witnessed the actual resurrection, even in the story. When the people encountered the risen Christ, they don't recognize him at first. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walked with Christ and talked with him without even knowing who he was. I mean, there are numerous details in the story which are there to tell you that you should not presume to think that you know what the resurrection is. Now, I believe that the resurrection is an event, yes, but it is obviously an event which is not described directly for a reason, which is told in a manner which should avoid a kind of forensic analysis. So does a Christian have to believe that the gospel describe events? Yes. Does a Christian have to believe that those descriptions have the modern journalistic or forensic type of description? No. Does a Christian have to believe in the resurrection of the body? Yes. Do we need to technically describe, like a surveyor would give a detailed analysis of a terrain, what the resurrection is? No. The resurrection imposes itself as the culmination of a giant pattern, a pattern which includes the natural patterns of death and rebirth, the seasons, the rotation of the cosmic bodies, a pattern which includes all the stories of the escape of the underworld, the crossing of the flood, and all the other tales of life rising out of death found in cosmic stories we remember and attend to until today. Even in our movies, in our TV shows, video games, comic books. I mean, the story of the resurrection is everywhere if you can see it.